So just quickly, because you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Pete tonight. This webinar is being put on, well, it's being hosted by the Get the Marches Buzzing project, which is a beelines project working within Shropshire and North Herefordshire to restore about 63 hectares of flower-rich habitat. And most of that is in the form of species-rich grassland, hence why we're doing a webinar this evening about hay meadows. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. I've just put a few of our funders on the screen there, so thank you to them for supporting our project and making this webinar happen. So without further ado, I will pass over to Peter Carty. A little bit about Pete. He is a former countryside manager at the National Trust based in Shropshire at Cardamom Valley, if anyone knows the area. He is now the chair of the Marches Meadow Group, a brilliant community group which you will hear about this evening. But if you're interested in meadows at all, I highly recommend looking them up online. I will send a link to their webpage in the follow-up email as well for anyone that's interested. And Pete's involved in lots of community projects, and he's now going to show you some case studies of some meadows that he's worked with or he knows of that's in the local area. So enjoy. And yeah, I'll put his PowerPoint up now and you can then start.
Thanks very much, Emily. The first slide, really, we can go straight past the first slide when you do get there. It was really just to do an introduction, which you've done. Thank you very much. So click the next slide, please.
Okay.
Okay, well, just briefly, why are meadows important? I think for me, we all love them. They're very beautiful places to spend time in them. When we're in there, everybody kind of just gets absorbed by them and notices their specialness. They're culturally important. It's how we've fed our animals in winter for centuries. And elements of managing meadows are caught up in the nursery rhyme, "One man went to mow," which captures the spacing of men scything the meadow. So in order to avoid one man scything the next man's ankles, they left a couple of seconds in between. So one man went to mow, off he went, a couple of paces, two men went to mow. And so a staggered line moved up the field, and the nursery rhyme captures that cutting of meadows with large numbers of people cutting the grass. And you can see that in some of the old pictures and references. For me, as a naturalist, I love them because they're full of plants and animals, and a very important source of food for insects and bugs, and small mammals build up the populations. You'll often see kestrels and barn owls hunting over meadows. Okay. And just to reiterate, I suppose, the importance of meadows, this is a photograph of a green-winged orchid in Minsterley Meadow, just outside the town of Minsterley, just south of Shrewsbury. It is for sale at the moment, and there are 3,500 at least green-winged orchids in Minsterley Meadow. It's the biggest population of these in Shropshire now, and they are an indicator of ancient meadows. They don't tolerate herbicide, they don't tolerate being ploughed up. So the fact that this population is here is telling us this meadow is an ancient hay meadow, and it's been cut for hay by a local farmer and grazed, and that low input old-fashioned farming has produced this meadow. And I mention this meadow because we've started a campaign to buy them, and at the two public meetings, Minsterley Public Hall was standing room only with over 100 people turning up. More people in that room than can be remembered in living memory. And this is because people were concerned about these meadows. They're part of the local walk that you take out of Minsterley on the way up to Pole's Cottage. They're right next to the playing fields, so people know them and love them and did not want them to be developed. And at the end of the first meeting, £12,000 had been pledged to buy them. I can tell you that our offer of £190,000 has been accepted, and we are now starting a process of trying to raise that money and apply for grants, and we've got 6 months to do it in. So meadows are important. Okay. This is Penally Meadows. I apologize for the photo. It's got a bit, it's lost some resolution. I tried to get a better one. This is Penally Meadows on the side of Stiperstones National Nature Reserve. Another ancient meadow heaving with flowers. Very, very important. And because of its importance, it's been declared a National Nature Reserve. Okay. There's a lot of history with meadows. This is an old map taken from Shropshire, from the place names of Shropshire. And in the middle of the map at the bottom, you can see the field name 8 Days Math. Math is Old English for mowing. So it took 8 days to scythe that field. And there's lots of place names, Meadow, Lee, and throughout the place names of Shropshire, many, many names relate to meadows because they were so important historically. Okay. Keep clicking. Thanks. Thank you. So we probably all know this, that meadows have largely disappeared. It's very difficult to make hay these days, and if you're a commercial farmer with the weather it is, it's getting close to impossible to cut hay, leave it to dry, ted it, turn it over, and bale it. So most farmers have gone on to silage because it's safer and more reliable for them. But having said that, there is still a role for hay in agriculture, and I'll mention that later. And it's increasing in value because Herefordshire hay has got a lot of trace elements and vitamins and medicinal value, and quite a lot of animal owners want flower-rich organic hay because of its medical value. From a worrying point of view, as a naturalist, it's worrying that these are now in small isolated fragments, and that plants and animals can't easily move between them anymore, which is a situation that leads to localized extinctions. Okay. And just click the text, thanks. Again, in Shropshire, that is repeated. Just go back one for a minute, Emily. Relics in churchyards, but increasingly there are a lot of projects in Shropshire and Herefordshire and other counties that I perhaps haven't heard of individuals working to restore meadows. And we've got a few examples here. Okay, please, to show you. So the first example is Dingy Meadows. They are at the north end of Longmynd. In the bottom photograph there, that photograph is looking from Dingy to Caer Caradoc across the A49. These meadows came up for sale in 2009, and I persuaded the National Trust to buy them. And I remember saying, I'm sure these are old meadows, they will become really good and flower rich. Fortunately, that has happened. I subsequently found out after the Trust acquired them that the two previous owners had never put any fertilizers or any herbicides or pesticides, either because, quote, they were too mean, or the earlier owners had no money to do it. In 2009, we switched the management from permanent pasture, so they were grazed pretty much all year round, and we switched that management to hay meadows. Next slide. And in the first year, it was a bit boring. Lots of grass, almost waist-high, thick grass, but lots of this little plant on the right, pignut, which is an umbellifer. It's in the carrot family. And pignut is an indicator of old, undisturbed grassland, and a good sign if you see it in a meadow. Okay. And thick grass is great if you want a productive crop to feed your animals, but it's not very good for wildlife. If you're a bird and that grass is wet and you're a young bird, you can't really move through it. That tall grass shades out the ground layer, and the aggressive nature of the grass means that there's very little room at the bottom for plants to appear. But, next slide. 5 years on, there was a dramatic change, and the grass got shorter and more spaced out, and you can see filled up with common flowers. Next slide, please. And what happened was this plant, yellow rattle, invaded. It wasn't introduced. It appeared without deliberate act and just went through the field and reduced the vigor of the grass. For those that hadn't come across yellow rattle before, it's a semi-parasite. So it provides nutrition by photosynthesis through the leaves, but its roots grow into the roots of particularly tall grasses and parasitize the sugars and starches and weaken them. So if you're a farmer, it's a pest. But if you're a conservationist and you're wanting to produce good habitat, it's the vital tool. How it arrived was, I found out later, our contractor, Jeremy Dale, cut several meadows that year. And he was working with a local seed merchant, Rob Lee. And Rob said the hay cutting machine broke down in the field, or in one of the fields, not July. And they were underneath it for a few hours fixing it. And the following year, there was a square of yellow rattle in that field from underneath the machine. So one means that yellow rattle moves around is the local contractor. And I think that's probably how it arrived at July. Next, please. Five, 6 years on, the meadow was transformed into something quite beautiful. Not only full of flowers, common flowers, buttercup, red clover and pignut, and a variety of yellow composites, cat's ears and hawkweeds and so on. But the structure of the grassland had changed. And on the photograph of the left, you can see that it's an open sward with space between the stems for a young bird to walk through, and the light is getting in and there's no competition from those tall grasses. Next slide, please. And a close-up of the meadow. Just, this is what I was talking about at the beginning of them being such beautiful places. It's this lovely open structure that you can easily walk through. It's not dense tussocky grassland that you're stumbling. It's not thick wet grass. It's lovely open sward with lots of flowers and lots of insects. And as often happens, I think 5 or 6 years down the road, it flushed with dog daisy. It boomed, thousands and thousands of them in the field, and now there's only perhaps a few dozen. And this is something that quite often happens in the development of meadows. Next, please. But very pleasingly, 6 or 7 years down the road, cowslips appeared. I have no idea for sure how they got there, but I did notice that badgers were moving into the field more frequently now that it was a hay meadow, and scratching the ground looking for leather jackets and earthworms. And again, Rob Lee told me that seeds will survive in soil for many, many decades, but just need to be exposed to the light. So perhaps these seeds have been in there possibly for nearly 100 years, or maybe had flowered occasionally and kept the seed bank going. But certainly I think it was in an area where badgers were digging. So the cowslips appeared. Next slide. So in spring, in the early part of the year, there's this lovely bit of colour on the side of the mind. Next, please. And then bit by bit, every year I noticed a couple of new species coming in. The purple flower on the right is tufted vetch. I think 6 plants appeared 6 or 7 years into the development. And as soon as they appeared in the meadow, the 6-pot burnet moth followed it in. The orchid appeared at a similar time, common spotted orchid. There's still only 1 or 2 plants, but I'm hoping eventually they will increase. And then, of course, with the plants come a whole range of insects, common blue butterfly, huge numbers of meadow brown, hundreds and hundreds of meadow brown. In the autumn, the field fills up with waxcap fungi. This is meadow waxcap. But in a 2-hour search, Rob Rowe, the local ecologist, found 15 or 16 species in 2 hours. And I think if you get 1 or 2 more than that, the meadow becomes recognized as nationally significant for its waxcap fungi. And you get to 21 species, and it's internationally important. Now, we haven't been able to DNA the soil. This is a technique that's come about relatively recently, partly because of capacity at the lab. But we'd like to DNA the soil in this meadow, which would identify all of the waxcap species. And I would bet good money that there's probably 20 species in there, because we now understand that this is an ancient meadow, an ancient remnant of grassland that survives. So I think waxcaps are a very good indicator of where to do good meadow restoration. Next slide, please. And one of the great successes, and one of the reasons why we bought the meadow, is that Longmynd has a good population of Bilberry bumblebee, which feeds on bilberry, but needs adjacent meadows as a nectar source for the whole year. And the position of Dingy meant that bilberry bumblebees moved into there in big numbers, and their population was supported by the mix of meadow next to heathland. And you can see the map there in the top left. Those 2 clusters of dots represent the Longmynd on the right and Stiper stones on the left, with a dot in North Shropshire, I guess for Wixhall or somewhere like that. So quite a rare bee, and the meadows are supporting that population. Next slide, please. And just a final photograph of Dingy in spring. It's become quite a short sward meadow now, because there's no fertilizers or inputs going in. And in fact, 1 or 2 years recently, the grass has been so short that it hasn't been possible to cut a hay crop. So we've simply grazed it off in the autumn. There is an argument, and certainly in the Dales, on some of these old meadows, they put a small amount of farmyard manure on. That lifts the hay crop, that makes it attractive to be cut by a farmer, and then you get the cut. But we get mixed advice on what to do here, and for the moment we're not bringing in any more nutrients, because it's clearly, doing very well without them. Next slide, please. So the final part of the story for Dingy is that the basic meadow is now lovely, but we really wanted to bring in some of the rarer species from Penally Meadows, the slide I showed you at the beginning. So we arranged for a green hay transfer. So the farmer at Penally cut the hay, baled it green, and you've got to be very quick with this because it starts to compost very quickly. And immediately we brought it into Dingy and spread it out. So we're hoping that we've transferred some of the rare species. And the next slide, please, Emily, shows one of the key ones that we would like to move around, which is greater butterfly orchid, which will move with green hay. It's been achieved in a few meadows around Stiper stones, and there's very few sites for it now in Shropshire. It's declined enormously, and we'd like to move it around to some of these new meadows that we're creating. So the green hay technique, I hope, will cause that to happen, and we'll see these appearing in the next year or two. Next slide, please. So the next example I have for you is Fir Tree Farm. That's the Longmynd in the background, and if you were to go to the top of the hill, you would be at the entrance to the gliding club at the south end of the hill. So having done the Dingy restoration, where in a way we got lucky because we bought ancient grassland. Here we wanted to see what we could do on improved agricultural fields. So the trust was able to buy lot 2 and lot 1. And next slide, please. And the field at the bottom there with the tree in is another. So 3 meadows were bought. Now these were intensively farmed up to 2000, and the previous owner on a small holding, on a small farm, I've just forgotten the acreage now, about 50, 60 acres, put an enormous amount of fertilizer on, £12,000 worth of fertilizer, and got £26,000 worth of grass off it. But in 2000, with changes to his business and new environmental grants, he accepted an ESA grant and stopped putting fertilizer or herbicide on it. So by the time the trust acquired it in 2018, it had had 15, 16 years of no inputs, but had been ploughed, reseeded and fertilized for decades before that. So this was a different kettle of fish. Next slide, please. And straight away, we had very good flowering of buttercup and red clover without doing anything. But next slide. We then introduced large amounts of yellow rattle. This time we spread it by hand. It was on a windy day, and the following year you could see where the wind had blown the drifts of yellow rattle. But the year after, the yellow rattle completely ran through the field. Next slide, please. And this is, well, we're still here with lots of buttercups, but ragged robins appeared, and quite a few other species are beginning to crop up. Next slide, please. This is a very welcome plant in these meadows. It's called eyebright, so called because you can make a solution from eyebright and add sparkle to the eyes for that Monday morning feeling if you so wish. But eyebright, light yellow rattle, is a hemiparasite and weakens the grass and opens up the sward. Next slide. And we're really pleased to see adder's tongue fern. This is an indicator of old grassland turning up in a former silage field after 18, 19 years of low input, followed by meadow restoration. And we found 200 plants of this. So very, very encouraging sign. Next slide, please. Bilberry Bumblebee moved in big numbers, which was great news. Next, please. And again, we have spread green hay from Pennerley Meadows. Quite an expensive operation, and a large amount of green hay have been brought in, and we're just waiting and hoping now. This will be the second year after the green hay. We're hoping for some of those rarer plants to come in. Next slide, please. So within the hay meadow, you need to think about other habitats. This is a drainage ditch on the side of fir tree. We've allowed it to become more naturalized. We're not digging it out. It's filling up with flowers. And you can see the line of buttercups and green grass there. That's the limit of the haymaking. So this ditch is a bit of a refuge for plant and animals to hide in after the hay's been cut in late July, early August. So it's really important to have some marginal habitats in and around the hay meadow. They support birds, bird nests and bees and all sorts of invertebrates at different times of the year. Next, please. And here, and this was an accident really, a ditch along the top side of the meadow became blocked and started overflowing and running through the meadow and creating this wet flush. And of course, if you're agriculturally minded, you wouldn't want this to happen because the water slows down the growth of the grass. But for us, we hope that curlews will come back to this field to nest. And so within the hay meadow, we've got tallish grass on dry grassland on the left for curlews to place a nest. curlews, like other waders, have to take their chicks to good feeding areas within an hour of hatching, and those areas need to be wet and damp because the little curlew chicks only have a bill of about half an inch, so they can't probe the mud very deeply. So the loss of wet hay meadows has been influential in the cause of the decline of curlew. So again, diversifying the meadow from a nature conservation point of view is good. Next, please. This was a visit to Fir Tree Farm by two senior managers who were so impressed they decided to invent meadow bathing and crashed out in the meadow and de-stressed from their busy jobs. But in the photograph, you can see that nearly the whole meadow now is dominated by yellow rattle, with a small patch of buttercups towards the top of the photograph there. So this is great. Yellow rattle's an early flower, April and May. And the other species that were present in the meadow was a little clover called lesser trefoil, Trifolium dubium, and ribwort plantain. All interesting plants, but they're all over by mid-late June. And this is a feature of the early stages of meadow restoration. You get a flush of these early flowering things, and you don't yet have got those later flowers, the perennials and the orchids that will sustain insects later in the year. And Debbie Viviers has been studying the bilberry bumblebee, found that fir tree meadows filled up with bilberry bumblebees, but in the end, towards the end of the year, they deserted it because there wasn't any pollen left. Interestingly, we then harvested this yellow rattle and got 150 kilograms of yellow rattle seed from here, which has a street value of £15,000. Next slide, please. And here is that seed collection, and Rob Lee, the seed merchant from Shrewsbury, who I think then supplied you, Emily, and Buglife with the yellow rattle for Barnes Farm, which we'll mention later. Next slide, please. So how do you get some of the other species back into the meadow that are lost? There are some perennial plants which are now very restricted in their distribution in Shropshire. Bethany on the left here in Rattling Hope Churchyard, just a few miles from Fir Tree. It doesn't seem to move about. It's a perennial, it gets cut every year, it comes back in large numbers. I think Emily's just hovering the mouse over a Bethany head there. So we took some advice from Plant Life, and I can recommend you going onto the Plant Life website and looking at some of their videos, short videos on how to make meadows in different situations. And we talked to other colleagues and other groups, and we decided that we needed to propagate these perennials. So I got my mother-in-law on the job, who's a very good gardener, collected the seed, grew them on and planted them out as plug plants in corners of the meadow away from where it was going to be harvested. And it has succeeded, but it's a bit disheartening. I think out of every 100 that I planted, there's about, well, maybe 10 surviving a few years. But hopefully they will then start to spread and move into the meadow. Hay meadows are almost entirely made up of perennial plants, so they can be cut and they'll come again. The one exception to that is yellow rattle, which is an annual. So if you start cutting the grass in early June before it sets seed, you'll wipe it out. Next slide, please. And here are plug plants going out. I think those are your gloves there, Emily, on the left. I can't just see what that is, but I think it's Bethany and Dog Daisy and Devil's Bit Scabious. Cowslips. Yes, cowslips. Thank you. Next slide, please. If you're lucky enough to be involved with a meadow restoration project, or you have a bit of land, it's really good to look at Old Maps. Old Maps is a website where you can look and see maps from different stages. This is Fir Tree Farm here. Can you maybe point to it, Emily? The two fields, the one in the top, yeah, that's it. There, stop there. Yeah. So that is the field that we were looking at before. And you can see in 1883, it was actually 3 fields and a bit of unenclosed Prolly Moor. And that bit of unenclosed land there is where that water is now flowing. And where Emily's pointer is right now was first recovered from Polymore in 1830. And that is the least interesting bit of that meadow. And I suspect that because it's been farmed for a long time, it's on a bit of higher ground, drier ground. Stock were overwintered there, dung in there, fed there. And although we haven't done the soil analysis, which is a shame, I suspect the fertility of that corner there is higher than the rest of the field. So you'll see quite a lot of clues to explain things that are going on in your meadow. And also you get the lovely old field names, which are great to keep alive. Next slide, please. So moving on to a project, which is how I met Emily and Kate from Buglife. 3 years ago, 3 years ago, the National Trust was extremely lucky because somebody left the Trust £1 million with a very specific request to buy a farm near Longmynd for it to be farmed organically for the benefit of wildlife. And this lovely farm, Barnes Farm, came up that had been farmed by an elderly brother and sister. They pushed it quite hard in the 80s, but then as they got older, the farm had reverted and many of the meadows naturally restored. And the farm was within the beelines area for the beeline that goes from Craven Arms to Bishop's Castle, or part of that beeline. And we partnered up with Buglife, and we're able, well, in fact, Kate and Emily really organised this. The yellow rattle seed came from Fir Tree Farm, about a quarter of a mile away, and we were able to upscale the operation to quite a large farming operation, as you can see with this level of kit here, which is scarifying the meadows. This is really important in establishing meadows, and you can see that meadows being cut, it's then being grazed off, and now it's being scarified to ideally 50% bare ground. And then the yellow rattle, next slide please, is applied to that. In the case of our kind of projects, we use volunteers and buckets, but obviously a farmer would use a seed spreader. But to keep the budget down, it's as you can see. Next slide, please. So we're going to another example now. This is Raglath Meadow. Raglath is on the east side of the A49 from Church Stretton. So go up the hill as if you're driving from Church Stretton to Much Wenlock, and Raglath is on the right there. For people in Shropshire will know that. This is John Bacon, who I'll tell you his story as we go. He is part landowner, part National Trust tenant, part National Trust partner, and also part advisor, because in a past life he was a chief warden for the Nature Conservancy Council and then Natural England, and an expert on meadows. And here he is with his badger-faced sheep. Next slide, please. This is John's garden. He bought the house in 1985 from 2 elderly ladies, and the garden was a meadow, and they said the meadow had never been ploughed in their lifetime, and they'd lived there a very long time, 60 years or something. And the meadow is almost entirely made up of devil's bit scabious and betony. So John knew he had a remnant of an ancient meadow there, and we've all been very jealous of it. Next slide. With his daughter, he bought and leased a couple of small meadows adjacent to that and started treating them as hay meadows, and they filled up with flowers. On the right here, you can see betony and black knapweed, and I've just forgotten the name, Burnet saxifrage, the autumn flowering umbellifer. Next slide. John runs training days. On the left in the inset photograph is the Marches Meadow Group seed collector. This is something that you can push through a meadow, and the brush there pulls the seed in, and you can collect nice amounts of seed, which make it easy to transport to another meadow. And in the photograph, the larger photograph, is a power strimmer that you can cut long grass with. Because if you let your long grass grow, you've got to have some means of cutting it. A scythe, a strimmer. Apparently scythes are always faster than strimmers, or a bit of machinery. So running little demonstration days was quite important. Next, please. And this is the National Trust owned bit of meadow, which we were able to pay to be cut and baled. And John then grazed it, the aftermath grazing, that word again, math, after cutting, with his badger-faced sheep. Next slide, please. And initially filled up with buttercups, often the first species to move into the meadow, but still a lovely structure to it, and lots of insects. And now it's almost wall-to-wall yellow rattle. Next slide, please. But we decided that we would diversify, and this is Raglath Meadow. On the right, you can see we've cut for hay. On the left, we've left it uncut, and we've planted some trees to make wood pasture. So instead of the bit on the left being cut, it's going to be grazed off slowly with John's badger-faced sheep, which is an old hardy breed capable of eating tough stuff and long grass. So in that picture, you can see that the hay meadow has been cut, but the insects and the small mammals can move into the uncut bit on the left. Next slide, please. And here's John running a training course for his neighbours. So he's set up a little kind of partnership of smallholders in the area and got them interested. In the centre of the photograph is Charlie Bell, who is the project officer for the Stepping Stones project, which is not for this talk, but is a big landscape scale project working across South Shropshire with the National Trust and Natural England, building partnerships. And here Charlie's supporting John in bringing his neighbours together, all of whom now are doing little bits of meadow management. So a little network of meadows over a few square miles is being generated. These are mostly smallholders. They're not in agriculture. They don't have to make their living from these meadows, and they're doing it as hobbyists. But it gives an opportunity to move the seed around and create nice habitat. Next slide, please. So, two more examples. This is a subject close to my heart. We've been lobbying Shropshire Council for 5 years now to try and get better grassland management on the roadside verges. And we now manage in some shape or form 10 kilometres of verge. About half of those are managed by negotiated late cutting, and the half are actively managed as hay meadows. And I'll show you some pictures. Next, please. Keep going. And you can see just a little bit of our history. A group of local volunteers supported by the Stepping Stones project and the Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and Caring for God's Acre, who look after grassland, who look after wildlife in churchyards, often looking after old grassland. And of course, there's always a church somewhere to create a nice little meadow if people agree. Next slide, please. Verges come in all shapes and sizes. The widest one is at Nind, at the south end of Stiperstones, and we've been able to acquire this. It's called a two-wheel tractor. That's a cut and collect system on the front there. We can also put a flail on it for cutting rough vegetation, and we can put a hay cutter, a disc cutter that'll cut the grass and lay it out to be collected or raked for hay. And that's been quite helpful. Next slide, please. Janet Cobb, who is on our committee, has generated something like 50 local groups around Shropshire over 5 years. Many of these people are working on verges 10 or 20 meters or 50 meters long by a meter, quite small bits. But the point is they're doing it very enthusiastically, talking to people, making sure that it's tidy and well managed and there's no visibility problems for traffic and things like that. So the movement is growing. It's small and patchy, but it's definitely growing. Next slide, please. Verges are important because they're pathways for wildlife. This is a particularly nice one in Devon. Next slide, please. Yep, next, keep going. Yep. The problem, as I'm sure people listening to this know, they're cut purely to keep them open for traffic, obviously important and the top priority, but they're often cut and dumped. In fact, if you click through now, I think there's some text with these pictures. Is that right? Yeah. And you end up with very fertile verges, the soil, high levels of nitrates and phosphates, and then you get this dense mat of hogweed and nettles, which is quite an important habitat, but it would be great if there was less of it and there was some better quality habitat. So next slide shows this very point. Well, let's just click over this one. I'm sure we can come back to that if needs be. This is one of our demonstration verges. Year one, 5 years ago, hogweed and nettles. We cut and collected it in year two, and in year two, it looked better already. On the left is what's called the safety strip. The council were very keen to make sure that there was good visibility. And then in year three, the yellow rattle took over, and the verge didn't need cutting at all. And the council engineers are now quite convinced that it is possible to manage verges as meadows, but it's complicated. It's complicated with budgets and mainframe contractors, employing other contractors, employing local contractors. And the council are not in a very good place in Shropshire. They've got to save so many millions of pounds, and it's not easy. But the highways engineers, they're engaged, and as I say, we've got 5 kilometres of verge managed like this. It's really the wide verges that we can get a tractor on or a machinery. Okay. And again, as plants come in, 6-pot burnet moths and butterflies appear. Okay. The last example is from Bishop's Castle, where a group of us have been doing wildlifey things for a number of years, and we've been building them up and building them up. And we've now secured a grant of £250 million. And that has set up a project to employ 2 people for 3 years to deliver wildlife recovery in Bishop's Castle, in the civil parish of Bishop's Castle, and to deliver for the town council their biodiversity recovery plan. They've signed up to it, but they don't have the means, the money, or the knowledge to do it. And our little group is basically saying, well, we'd love to do it for you, give us the chance. And they are fully supportive and gave us a little grant to kickstart things. Next slide, please. This is one of our trial projects. We call it Pam's Meadow because a lady called Pam lives next door to it, who is a staunch defender of it. It's actually owned by the Housing Association, and it's supposed to be a flower-rich meadow in the original plan. But as can happen, the maintenance people really want a simple life, and they started just mowing it every few weeks. And Pam has been nurturing these cowslips. So she saw them turn up one day and got very enthusiastic and forthright and clear about what she thought should happen. And they agreed not to mow it. And a few years later, it looks like this in the middle. A really nice flower-rich tall meadow. The white flower is hedge bedstraw, and the yellow flower is ladies' bedstraw. And you can see black knapweed there and tall grass. And this is right amongst a whole load of young families and kids. It's only a small area, as you can see, 40 meters by 30 meters or something like that. But I've seen kids wandering around in there, playing in long grass, looking at flowers. And, it's bringing nature to where people live. And the local people really love it. They really love this meadow. Next slide, please. So we thought, aha, let's grow a project. So we got a big map and we asked local people to put on what they were doing for wildlife. And about 70 dots appeared, from ponds to mini meadows to planting trees to various bird boxes and all sorts of things. And there was a clear interest in the community in doing more. So next slide, please. More consultation, couple of more small grants, and then we built up a head of steam and enough evidence to convince the National Lottery to give us £250,000, which was brilliant. Next slide, please. And here we've got 32 green spaces in Bishop's Castle that we're going to write a management plan for. We're going to do wildlife and nature stuff, whether it's in the school grounds or the park or the castle land or bits of land that nobody is using. We've got a whole host of stuff planned for that. Next slide, please. And this is one of the nice projects that a local resident has done. No Mow May, you might have heard of. Let your grass grow long for a few weeks, or leave it as what's been called a buzz cut, so that you cut it at 10 centimeters and let the clovers and flowers feed the bees. And this very beautiful meadow appeared out of a lawn just by letting it grow. And quite a few people now, more than 10, are beginning to do this. And we hope, it'll spread, but we'll see. Not everybody likes long grass. It can divide people, so you have to be careful. Some people like lawns, and that's just how we are. It's one of those Marmite moments. Next slide, please. The other element of the project is a wildlife kids club. And within a few months, we built up to 30 kids coming out once a month doing nature stuff. And we've got a waiting list of more kids who want to join. And with the grant, we're going to be able to expand this activity to a full nature club. Next slide, please. I mentioned churchyards before. I have to mention churchyards because my wife, Harriet, is the director for Caring for God's Acre. But that aside, churchyards are fantastic places for wildlife, particularly the old churchyards where perhaps there's no living relatives of the people buried in them. And it's so much better to allow them to become a little meadow and cut them once in the autumn with a load of jolly volunteers and scythes. And they soon fill up. They're often ancient grassland because they've been enclosed for a very long time before herbicides and fertilizers and so on. So there's great opportunity in churchyards. Churchyards are everywhere. They're accessible, often level, accessible to all sorts of people, close to schools, the heart of the community. Great place to start. Very often the vicar will bite your hand off if you want to help manage the grass in the old part of the meadow. Next slide, please. And this is what it kind of looks like in practice. This is Bishop's Castle churchyard getting cut and raked in the autumn. And you can imagine if you get 20 or 30 people going, it's quite a jolly day out, tea and cake, or a trip to the Six Bells, which is just across the road, which is helps things along a lot. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, I suppose what we're trying to do is link bits of old grassland through verges with other bits of old grassland so that bees, insects and birds and small mammals can move through the landscape and find shelter, find food, and nectar and so on. A bee can't fly very far without refueling, so you really need regular fueling stops. Next slide, please. Is there some text with that, Em? Yes. So I think the take-home message, anyone can make a difference. Yes, you can volunteer or donate, or if you've got a garden or a window ledge, think about making it a stepping stone. Just do a little bit. And the final slide, I think, is Tess, who lives in Bishop's Castle, very keen botanist, let her lawn grow up and found some adder's tongue fern, which, as I said before, is an indicator of old grassland. So parts of Bishop's Castle probably have enclosed old grassland in them, which is why this adder's tongue fern was there. I think there's one last slide to finish with, which is the end, and thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Pete.
Okay.
It was brilliant. I think it's so nice to see all those different case studies that you have. So you've got your big, large scale meadows, but then you can also do something in your own front garden as well, which is brilliant. And exactly the point. And we're just in time for No Mow May as well. So if anybody fancies, they've been inspired by this talk and they think that, oh yeah, maybe I could let the grass grow a little bit longer in my front garden or my back garden. Yeah, you should definitely do it if that's something that you're interested in. I find that sometimes I suppose it can look untidy. So I mean, I put it in my own front lawn this year, and I've just sort of mowed a patch around it so it looks like it's supposed to be there, which is the key. So if anyone has any questions, please fire away. We've got 5 minutes before the end. But I had a question actually, Pete. So you mentioned a few different methods of seeding and introducing seed into meadows. So you've used green hay, but you've also hand seed sown. What method do you think is the best from your experience? Because I know green hay can be a bit tricky logistics wise.
The Meadows Group believe green hay is the best, because not only do you introduce seed, but you introduce fungi, insect eggs. You're moving a bit of the natural ecosystem. However, it is difficult to do because you've got to have your donor site ready and your receptor site ready, and you've got to be able to move it on the same day and have a team of people cutting it and a team of people spreading it. And that's fine in nice weather. But when the weather's bad and people then go on holiday, it's quite difficult to organize. So we are mostly now going for seed.
Yeah.
Because seed is much more manageable. But even if you can only move a dumpy sack of green hay, so half an hour's work, put it in the boot of your car and move it. Do it if you can. But seed, and try different things in different places. So if you've got a big meadow, you could do a little bit of green hay on one side and seed on the other, and see if you can pick up any difference. And it's always different. Every meadow's slightly different, and people do things slightly differently. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that really, that you bring a whole host of other things with you when you bring the hay, not just the seed. Yeah. Well, something to bear in mind for future projects. Anyway, we've got a few hands up, so I will see if I can make this work and unmute these people. So we've got Mike here. I've allowed your mic now, so if you unmute yourself manually, you can ask the question. Oh, yeah.
Got it. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks very much indeed, Pete. To introduce myself, I'm Mike White. I lead the Bushmore Verges project, which is a length of roadside verge for about a mile on the outskirts of a hamlet in Shropshire, in South Shropshire. And we've been out today on the verges, funnily enough. I wanted to ask Pete a question, really, which is about anaerobic digestion. And I just wonder, because this is the disposal, the effective disposal of vegetation that is cut and collected and taken away to reduce the nutrient level in the roadside verge. And I'm just wondering where we're at with that. I'm thinking particularly in Shropshire at the moment. There seemed to be a bit of a question around the economics of it, whether it's worth anybody doing it and using it as a byproduct of verge management. So I just wonder where are we currently up to with that?
Well, hello, Mike. I recognise your voice. So as you know, we tried it 2 years ago and it worked. But the people running the anaerobic digester said, yeah, fine, we'll have as much as you can bring, but there's no financial incentive for us to pay you to deliver it. So the cost had to be borne by the people managing the verge. The next thing that we're going to try, and we're going to try it through the Go Wild project, and in fact, anyone can try it, is try and turn grass verge arisings into biochar, which is kind of a new, it's charcoal by another name. And you basically have a dish on the side of the road that you smoke it in. But I don't know how much smoke it produces and whether that becomes a hazard or not. And that would be great because biochar is then small and portable and high value. So we will have a look at that, but I just don't know. The conclusion that a few of us have come to is that we're going to compost at the end of the verge. So we'll cut, collect and make a compost heap at the end of the verge. And I think other councils have done that. And as long as you keep it tidy, it's probably the most cost-effective thing at the moment until the value of arisings gets to a point where someone wants to pay for it. And then the verges will come back to life then.
Interesting. Watch this space then.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. That's very helpful. Yeah. Thank you, Emily. That's me. I'll remute.
Okay. So we've got Julie here. So I'm going to allow your mic. So if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question as well.
Hi Emily and Pete, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, quite inspiring. I'm wondering how far your Marches Meadow Group, the northern range, because we're up near Oswestry and we have inherited a meadow basically, and we've got great horseshoe orchid in it, and just wonder if within your parameters or whether we could talk to somebody else about it.
So what we can do is if you want one of us to visit, we can come and visit and share any knowledge that might be of use to you. It might also be that you have a lot of knowledge of that meadow that might have used a lot of use to us. So it would be a two-way thing. So certainly we could do a visit. What we can't do in Oswestry is it's too far out of the range for our contractors. So if you choose to or need to get it cut, you would need to find a local contractor. And we have tried to, Janet Cobb and various people, I think, there's a lot of interest at a recent conference in Oswestry. And maybe there's an opportunity to try and get a group together there to help one another. I'm not sure.
Okay, that sounds good. We've hand sized it to date. It's not a huge area. I suppose it's about 1/4 acre, so it's not enormous, but it does look very species rich. So I will be in touch, and yes, we'd love somebody to come and have a look at it. Thank you. Really good.
I'd love to see it. There's some great meadows around Oswald Street, particularly near the limestone.
Yeah, we've got common spotted orchid, ladies' tresses, and it is maturing. We can certainly see that. So yes, come and see us soon. That would be great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right, Pete, do we have time for one more question? Or
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll do one more question. And I know 2 other people have got their hands up, but you might have to email me your questions and we'll ask Pete to answer them that way, because we're running out of time. So Mike, I'm hoping that you'll be able to unmute yourself now and then ask your question. Mike Collins. We can't hear you, Mike. Are you able to unmute yourself next to the camera button at the top? Well, that's where it is on my screen. Well, perhaps if you wanted to put it in the chat.
Oh. Can you hear? Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Yeah, really interesting, really fascinating talk, Pete. Thanks very much. We've just set up a community group. I live in Bath, and we just set up a community group to manage, be managing 16 acres of council-owned land. So they've agreed. It's linked to some of the biodiversity United Game funding, but they've agreed a sort of 30-year lease with the community group to sort of manage the site. It used to be grazed, but it hasn't been grazed for a long while, so it's all sort of matted, thatched type grass, and there's not really much in there. There are quite a few butterflies, so sort of 16, 17 species, and some of the burnet moths, which is nice, and some anthills. But we were just at the start of the journey, and I was wondering if there was sort of, when you were at some of the projects you were talking about, the sort of 2 or 3 things to really get started, because I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, and I always worry that we'll end up trying to do everything rather than focus on a couple of things. And I think the points you made around the time it takes, so it will take a while for things to change, but if there were a couple of things you could recommend us starting to focus on initially, potentially.
Well, it's very good if you can get someone to have a look around as it is now, a local ecologist or naturalist, to just see if there's any, just see what's there and have a little bit of an insight. And as you say, you don't have to do everything at once. You could just do, a half an acre or a small area, see how it works, learn your skills, get some training courses done. I'm sure in that area there will be people who would help, and if not, one of us would come and have a look if that's of any use. But yeah, just build links with local naturalists and ecologists, and local contractors who might have a bit of machinery. Hire machinery rather than buy it at first. Look after your volunteers, make sure they have a good jolly time, and tea and cake and a social time. All that's very important. And have a look at the Plant Life website and the Buglife website, and your local wildlife trust will be very active. It's very active down there, I know, and in Bristol and Avon nearby, there's lots of active work. Yeah, I mean, do keep in touch. Get back and have a longer phone call. Get my phone number off Emily and have a longer phone call if that's useful.
No, that'd be great. I'm actually quite lucky because there's a couple of fields nearby that are privately owned that have hundreds of pyramidal orchids in. So actually chatting to those guys that own that to see in terms of the cutting of the seed and stuff, which again is sort of novice to this area in terms of land management. So yeah, that was really useful. But yeah, I will do that. That'd be great. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and a big thank you, Pete, for delivering such a great
Thank you.
webinar. I think everyone's really enjoyed themselves, and anyone that hasn't been able to watch it tonight, I'm sure they'll love catching up. So yeah, and thank you everyone for joining us and for all your nice questions. If you have any other questions that you want to send my way, hopefully you should have my email address, but if not, I'm going to be sending out the follow-up email, so you'll get it then. But have a lovely evening, everyone, and I'll say goodbye for now. Hopefully see you again all
Brilliant.
soon.
Thanks, Emily. Brilliant. Brilliant.
Thanks,
Thank
Pete.
you. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Have a nice evening.